Okay, thanks ladies and gentlemen for joining us today on spinal cord, spinal column, and spinal cord reflexes, and the reflex arc. Fourth time's a charm for me, I'm afraid. Having some technical difficulties, so we'll see how this works out. All right, growth mindset. We can do that. You know, there's no such thing as failure as long as you keep trying, right? All right, so let's do that. We're going to talk about the spinal cord and the fact that it transmits information to and from the brain and the rest of the body, the periphery. It integrates and figures out how to respond to the reflexes too. We have spinal cord reflexes that only go to the spinal cord and go back and have an effect and don't go to the brain. And then we have reflexes that do go to the brain as well. But we're going to learn about the spinal cord reflexes only. First, we need to introduce you to a new cell, the interneuron, okay? Aptly named because he forms a bridge, if necessary, between the sensory cell and motor neuron. We're going to make him, what did we decide to make him? I'm going to make him yellow, okay? Because we're really excited about our interneuron here. And hopefully that's bright enough for you to see. I'm changing colors because I'm trying to actually make it a little more friendly for people who are colorblind. All right, interneurons are found entirely within the central nervous system. They carry either sensory or motor impulse, that's the efferent or afferent pathway, and serve as a link between a sensory and motor neuron we talked about. Another structure we're going to introduce you to is the ganglia. They're clusters of cell bodies located outside of the central nervous system. Now, they're actually in your spinal cavity. It's just they're not in the spinal column. So we'll look at that in a second. Actually, ganglia are clusters of cell bodies of only sensory neurons. That's important. Because the cell bodies of interneurons and motor cells are generally in the spine itself and contribute to something we call the gray matter. Talk about gray matters. Cell bodies of motor neurons, they're not myelinated, right? We talked about how axons are myelinated, dendrites can be myelinated. The cell bodies are not, and they look gray in the microscope because there's a whole bunch gathered together in the same place. Interneurons as well have their cell bodies in the spinal cord. So there's no myelin and they appear gray. Cool. So likewise, if you're destroying gray matter, destruction of gray matter means you're destroying the cell body and then you'll destroy the neuron. So that's the most important part of that cell, and it needs its cell body intact. All right, so neurons can, repair dendrites and axons and stuff like that. But once the cell body gets destroyed, that neuron's going under. All right, looking at our picture here, this is a cross section of your spine. It's maybe a bologna slice thick, and we also sliced it at the point where the nerves are going in and out. And this is actually happening between vertebrae. Okay, so that's why we have like so many little inky dinky vertebrae holes in and out in between, as you'll kind of see below a little bit. So to orient ourselves, we have a dorsal and a ventral side, and to be able to tell which one's which, kind of have to talk about the gray matter a little bit. So you'll find out in a second. But the gray matter, all the cell bodies are contained in this middle, and they make like an H shape. Okay, so let's just shade this with your pencil so that you know that this is happening several hundred times over, again and again and again, that you're going to have all these cell bodies through these connections of neurons to neurons, and they're going to be pixelated. Like really, like it's more like that, dot from all the cell bodies, okay? And on the dorsal side, the gray matter could extend out. The rest of the stuff, you might be like, what's that? It's white, and it is where axons come in, and so it's myelinated. So we might want to just label that, so give you kind of an idea how we're looking at this. White matter That's the myelin. And another word for white matter are fire tracks, since there are all these axons that are delivering signals and making connections between neurons. All right, and the reason why white matter looks like the white color because of the myelin. That's the from in this case the oligodendrocytes, and it's making that myelinated insulation, so that keeps that axon signal going. We have a so this is the dorsal side. I only do a D with a little circle for dorsal, just to save time and kind of is my standard. Also, the other side must be ventral. Oh, we didn't label gray matter. Here, right here on your notes, why don't you label gray matter? Goodness. And gray can extend on the dorsal side, most likely. It doesn't show in my picture, but that's okay. The ventral side, now in this picture you may not know, but there actually is kind of a bit of a notch that's a little more exaggerated, or at least it comes in there. Maybe the larger notch is on the ventral side. That could happen in some places because, you know, spinal cord is going to look a little bit different depending on if you're talking about the superior end or closer to the posterior end for reasons. So this notch on the ventral side is usually bigger, and I think of it making like a V. In this case, it looks upside down, but if I turned my sheet around, it would be a V. So usually a bigger notch right here. That's how you can kind of tell which one's the dorsal side and which one's ventral. Okay. Just one way. Okay, another structure you might want to familiarize yourself is this little swimming pool little thing in the middle. I kind of had to, it fell off my notes, so I had to put a shape there, and it filled in, and okay, technology, yay. So this is the central canal, and it's hollow, and it's lined with ependymal cells, just like the ventricles in your brain. We talked a little bit about that and how that allows cerebral spinal fluid to flow and takes away toxins and brings nutrients to the neurons, okay? So we have cerebral spinal fluid being created and flowing through the central canal, also around the spine. And we'll see a little bit later how that kind of also, cerebral spinal fluid is bathing your spine and hopefully bathing your neurons in lots of nutrients and taking away toxins. And of course your neurons need oxygen, and then you get rid of CO2 waste. That's another reason why your central nervous system operates on mostly glucose and not more complex, larger molecules, because they have to diffuse. And we know that we have astrocytes to also help, which we'll learn about. We already kind of learned about astrocytes in the central nervous system. So now you're familiar with a little bit of structure here. Let's kind of go through the signal going in and out. Let's do sensory neuron information. Sensory neuron information goes into the spine through the dorsal side. Always, okay? I like to think of it as like if you're having a back massage, since the dorsal is your back, think of your dorsal fin. You know, you really feel that sensation. So that's kind of one way I can remember that the sensory neuron goes into your spine on the dorsal region. And let's make that a nice, lovely blue sensory color here. Now, this was the long dendrite. Remember we talked about sensory neurons having long dendrites, because now we're gonna cross a cell body, and the cell bodies for the sensory neurons are they all stack up in now what becomes a ganglia. All right, and so here's the cell body. Now, first we got to label this sensory neurons coming in. Remember, they're really long. It's the dendrite. So what makes it kind of different than interneurons and motor neurons. So the info is coming from receptors on the sensory neuron. Yeah, I know, I'm excited about these markers. I don't know why. They show up, that's why. Okay, and there's the sensory cell body. We're going to have several hundred of these coming in, and so we're going to have lots of cell bodies in here. So on this side, let's just label that so we can remind ourselves that this is a ganglia, but we specifically are going to call it the dorsal root ganglia because it looks like a part of a root. These several hundred bundled neurons. Yeah, and it has the cell bodies of sensory neurons. I guess we can remind ourselves. The left and right side are symmetrical here in this case. And so the cell body of sensory neuron could modify the information, could modify the signal coming in, could enhance it or could kind of ignore it, honestly. So there's one checkpoint there. And then we're going to have the axon. All right, so the axon comes into the spinal column, enters the central nervous system. This is central nervous system, the spinal column. Otherwise, we would be peripheral. And it could go directly and dead end directly with a motor neuron, as we'll see on the next page, and have a very simple reflex. Or we could dead end into at an axon terminal to the dendrite of an inner neuron, our new friend, the inner neuron. And his dendrite is a lot closer to his cell body, so that's going to be like its cell body. I picked yellow. We'll see if it kind of holds up against this gray matter. Maybe make gray matter lighter, okay? No mistakes, just happy mistakes. I don't know. Bob Ross. Okay, so then we're going to have the axon of the inner neuron, and for the next level of complexity, it's just going to dead end directly into a motor neuron. So that's its axon terminal. It has possibly, more connections than that, but in this very simple reflex, it's going to go directly to a motor neuron. I'm not labeling the inner neuron because I labeled it above here in yellow, but we're going to make the motor neuron and its dendrites, little receptors on the dendrites, and its cell body of the motor neuron picks up here. So you can kind of get the idea. You got a cell body of the inner neuron and you got a cell body of the motor neuron, and this happened several hundred times. They've grouped together, and here, you're going to have lots of black dots and make the gray matter, okay? So then it's going to leave, signal's going to leave through an axon to the motor neuron to the effector, right? So we were affected, so the afferent pathway came in, brought the signal in to the spine from the sensory neuron, and it went out via the efferent pathway to have an effect on your body and make an effect, hopefully. So motor neuron, we're making red. And basically the signal is going to go to muscles or glands. So we'll call that signal info. And if you have cat-like reflexes, you're going to have really good signal. Hopefully. Okay. So yeah, let's label this here. That was the cell body of a motor neuron. Maybe I'm going to put some regular pencil here so that it doesn't all look like the same. Okay. But hey, let's highlight this in red so we can really making a difference here. That's the motor neuron carrying the signal out via the axon, doing the acting on, and they're going to go elsewhere in your body. Okay, so that's the pathway that a nerve signal could travel. That's very simple for the spinal cord reflexes. Of course, also, you're using the same cells, or possibly could, for more complicated reflexes and complicated responses, only the inner neuron is going to go up to the brain with the via the ascending tracts, and then if it's a very complicated response, you really want to think about it a lot, then the brain can integrate that information, maybe can learn and store the information, and then maybe send a signal back out as a reaction. So the more complex the reflex, or the higher up on the brainstem and there's spinal cord and brainstem, and in the brain that the processing going to occur in. So, yeah, and you might have learned responses that are going to respond differently. Like if it's your brother bugging you, you probably have learned to ignore him. And then you're thinking in your brain, okay, I'm going to go complain to my parents later that he's bugging me, but I'm not going to respond because he just wants a response from me. Okay? Yeah, I've been there. We call this outcropping, by the way, of gray matter on the ventral side, the ventral horn. And we call the outcropping of gray matter on the dorsal side, cleverly named dorsal horn, because I guess it's coming out in a horn. Okay? Now, in this case, this was, I guess, maybe could have been right side body reflex and information and reflex pathway. We have the mirror image on the left side. So you could have reflex happening on the left side only. Now, you'll notice also that you have sensory neurons coming into the spine at the dorsal horn. And it looks like, since we have several hundred of these axons and dendrites so much, they look like a root, so you can actually see them. So yeah, like they called these the dorsal root. You got to remember the dorsal root, though, is sensory neurons bundles. And then the ventral root is on the ventral side, and that's going to be motor. Fun. All right. And it's no trick of the imagination. So we can kind of like do this again, have the inner neuron, if the inner neuron is involved, that's where it would be, taking the information from the dorsal side and going out. Let's make a little dark mark there to kind of emphasize that, via the axon terminal to the dendrite receptors and past the cell body of the motor neuron. Your cat-like reflexes are going to pick it up, and the signal is going to be carried away from the central nervous system, the efferent pathway, out to your muscles and glands, stuff like that. Have some sort of response. Now, what's weird about this is that the nerve and muscle cells, they bundle together after they leave your spinal column, and we call them spinal nerves because they're coming off the spine. So this might be inside your spinal column, but these are outside, and we'll call these spinal nerves. Remember, a nerve is several hundred bundled neurons so that you can actually see them. Otherwise, it'd be too tiny. And we call it mixed because it's both sensory and motor going off the spine. All right. Now, for nerves coming off your cranium, for the 12 cranial nerves, some of them are not mixed. All right, some of them are purely motor tracks. Some of them are purely sensory, okay? We'll talk about those later. Okay, can you see that? Spinal nerves, mixed nerves. Okay, I gotta make sure you can see this because it's like angled really severely. Then we're gonna talk about a little bit about the white matter of the spinal cord. The white matter is arranged into ascending, which would be sensory, right? Tracts that carry information to the brain. And then we can have descending motor tracts that carry information away from the brain. Some of these signals will only reach the base of the brain. They're simple, like ducking, dodge, duck, dip, dive, and dodge. But the descending will be motor via this method here. And these motor tracks are going to, of course, carry information away from the brain. So descending is away. Does that make sense? Because we consider your head above your body, or on the top part here. So spinal cord. Spinal cord is what's inside your vertebral column, and it runs from what we call the foramen magnum. Foramen just means hole in the bone. Could be a hole for regular nerves, but it's a very large hole that your spine goes into your brain. So we call it the magnum. It's this large hole. Y'all have lots of holes in your head like me, but that's good. So it runs from the occipital bone, and your spinal cord then runs to discs L1 and L2. But you're like, wait a minute, but your spinal column runs all the way down to sacrum. Well, not in that form, okay? See, the deal is, coming off of your spine, here in this picture, you have lots of pairs of spinal nerves, mixed nerves, coming in and out. And as you go down your spine, those spinal nerves have left. So you're actually going to get less and less of a concentration of spinal nerves as you get down to the lower parts of your spinal column. There's actually 31 pairs, by the way, of spinal nerves that take information to and from the spinal cord. They're all coming in and out in between these vertebrae. And they're all mixed. We talked about that. But towards the end, towards lumbar region, L1 and L2 vertebrae, sorry, it's going to simplify a little bit. We don't need to be all grouped in one spinal column. So here's a kind of exaggeration. Your spinal column is going to narrow, and then eventually the nerves, the spinal nerves, just start branching off earlier because they don't need to be together. There's less concentration of them. They don't need to worry about it. Then they go to their places that they need to, their respective places. The L between L3 and down to sacrum number 5. Okay. What's neat about that? This is between L1 and L2, like we promised. Is that it looks like a tail. So your dreams came true. You have a tail. It's just in your spine. Yeah, as part of your spine. So somebody looked at it and was like, "Oh, weird. It's really long. It's kind of like a horse's tail." So that's what they called it. Cauda is tail. You can think of because it's the lower part of your body. Posterior, and then equina, like equestrian for horse. Okay, so there's your horse's tail. All right, so that's fun. I don't know why I put that in quotes, but not that one. That's fine. Okay, let's talk about the spinal picture. It's kind of neat. Tells you what the spinal nerves do that enter and exit in between each one of these vertebrae. Okay, we have cervical nerves in and out of the cervical vertebrae. And, of course, we have ones that innervate your head and neck. That's for movement and sensation. And then biceps and deltoids and wrist and your hands, your arms, stuff like that. But then you have your diaphragm thrown up in there. And you're like, wait a minute, diaphragm's lower down in my body, right? You're going to find out, super important to have your diaphragm so you can breathe. Okay? Maybe you can see this. I don't know. So your diaphragm, you need it for breathing. And I believe this is for like protection. I think this is a good adaptation or whatever. That because down here you have your thoracic nerves, chest muscles and abdominal muscles. Those are important, Chest muscles will help you breathe too, but that's your intercostals, not your diaphragm. And then you have your lumbar nerves. You have your leg muscles, and then your sacral nerves, bowel, bladder, sexual function, which you probably think are super, super important. But as far as survival goes, you probably need your leg muscles just a little bit more. Who cares if you can't control your bowels or your bladder? Okay, those are just your conscious control over there. Okay, it's fine. So the deal is, if you hurt your spine, you can crack a vertebrae, crunch your vertebrae. It can cut off the cerebrospinal fluid flow and or blood supply, or physically pinch nerves and cut the nerves off. And then if the nerves don't get enough nutrition, they will die. And then pretty much everything below in the spinal column could be affected by that injury, say if it was up here or up here. So the lower down the injury, the less likely that it's going to do as much damage as far as damaging something that was crucial for survival, right? So this is where you're gonna have some of your injuries. If you have somebody who's a paraplegic and they just can't walk, but they can use their arms for their wheelchair, then they have maybe an injury down here in the lower thorax or lumbar, and then everything below it might lose function, either completely or incompletely. Okay, because the nerves all come to and from the brain, so they need this pathway. So you can imagine that is you're done with those functions if they can't, if they've lost their connection, for example, or those nerves have perished. So it's a really, really important that you can breathe. So it's good that diaphragm's up here. We also have some visceral cranial nerves that come right off the cranium, and that's good too. But they're not on this picture. They don't go through your vertebrae. And those are good. It's crucial for survival and innervating your intestines and digestive system and such. So yeah, if you get a break real far up here, head and neck injury, it could be lights out. And the weird part with that is that it may not manifest right away. Okay, you might have somebody who's walking around and it's like, I'm fine after crunching their neck or whatever, but that's just because the neurons haven't died yet. And it's just a slower process of them getting deprived of oxygen and nutrients. So that's why it's super important if you think somebody has a head or neck injury, not to move them, mobilize and wait for professional help to get there, so they can possibly keep the function of their nerves down their spine. You know, even if they don't have total function, at least maybe have some function and maybe get some of that function back, even if they've lost some. So the next picture is between the vertebrae. So they kind of chopped it off, and then the spinal cord, so you can kind of see how that plays out in real life. Here's your central nervous system, spinal cord, the dorsal and ventral. In this case, the notches look exactly the same, but I don't think that's super true to life. And you can't really see the dorsal side has more gray matter extension. But you see the sensory neurons and the motor neurons entering and leaving, even though it's within the spinal column, and then they bind together and become your spinal nerves. And they're in between all these vertebrae. So, when you have vertebrae kind of out of alignment, it's important, it's probably going to hurt. You got nerves right there, and they're being affected, and you might get some numbness and some other neurological effects if you've had... if your vertebrae are out of alignment, okay? So yeah, it's good. Good posture is good too, but you might have to get that dealt with, okay? So next we're gonna talk about spinal cord reflexes, and they're fairly simple. Oof, my setup here is not so great. We're gonna talk about the most simple one first, okay? And what is a reflex? We're gonna talk about the whole reflex. So that's called the reflex arc, by the way. So let's call that reflex arc, in case somebody asks. A reflex, what is it? It's an involuntary response. You might be able to have some control over it, but at least your body's trying to initiate some sort of response to a stimulus. And spinal cord reflexes do not depend on the brain, although the brain can inhibit or enhance them, as we said before. Reflex testing is done to test the condition of the nervous system and kind of tap into that and see how healthy and how by seeing how fast your spinal cord reflex is and if it's responding at all, I guess. So the first one we talk about is a very simple one. We call it a stretch reflex. And what that is it's where if a muscle gets stretched, it will automatically contract. And you're like, wait a minute, why is that good? Well, one good reason is this enables us to stay upright. You can feel a muscle stretching. That means you're kind of leaning to one side, and that muscle needs to stand upright to push the floor down and help us not fall over. Okay. Also, is a good reflex because let's say if, Tiger's got your arm and he's pulling on it, it's going to keep your arm from being ripped off, hopefully. So that's good too. Unfortunately, when you're trying to stretch before, let's say, some sort of sport, your body may automatically have what we call stretch. I'm blanking on the name. Inhibition, stretch inhibition. And that's where your body thinks that you're trying to rip off its limb because, sometimes stretching, we'll feel like that. So what you have to do is kind of fool your spinal column into not reacting. So you kind of have to stretch, relax, stretch a little bit more, relax, and kind of tell your spinal cord, don't worry, I'm not trying to rip a limb off, okay? So that's good. Here, let's zoom out a little bit. All right, so here we have a reflex arc. We're going to do steps 1 through 5. And that's our reflex arc. And what that is the pathway that nerve impulse travels when a reflex is initiated. N's and R's. I don't know. Okay, so now we know what a reflex arc is. We got it in our notes. In this case, the stimulus is on purpose, and it's a doctor, and it's with one of those little hammers. What's going to happen is it's gonna whack in between the two bones. I mean, in between the patella and tibia, and it's gonna stretch the muscle via the patellar ligament, I'm assuming. So number one, there's receptors in every muscle that I know of. Yes, receptor's gonna detect a change. And generates an impulse. And for those of you super curious how that happens, you literally have channels on these receptors, and if they physically get stretched on the surface of the phospholipid membrane, then the channel is going to physically open. So kind of rudimentary. So number 2, sensory neurons going to send that signal to the CNS, because you're being affected, so that's your afferent pathway. All right. Remember, we're talking about dendrites too, right? Because we haven't even got to the cell body. It's a long dendrite on the sensory neuron. Travels to the central nervous system, just like we said in the column. And let's just remind ourselves that that is the afferent pathway, right? Just to let you know, this little structure is supposed to represent the femoral nerve. It's a mixed nerve. That's the sensory neuron coming in, and the motor neuron, as I was talking about in a second, going out. So, femoral nerve. Each. Did I leave room for that? Okay. Afferent doesn't go necessarily with femoral nerve. Femoral nerve, as you know, has both the afferent and the efferent. So it's going to go through the dorsal root ganglion. It's going to go to the dorsal side of the spine. Oh, I'm crowding here. And here's a dorsal root. So that's what those are trying to point to. Just kind of like we talked about. And then this one goes directly to the motor neuron. So this is just like our little picture of that cross-section of the spine. Ooh, you can't even see that. Why didn't you say something? Kidding. White matter here. Gray matter here. And of course, this is that synapse. Right? That's where neurons talk to each other. So you have the axon terminal sensory cell directly to the dendrite receptor on the muscle cell. Yes, all within the central nervous system. So we should make that pathway, because, you know, we've been trying to color code things. Blue. All right, we're good. Down here is the ventral root, as promised. Okay, so you're asking me why I didn't color sensory root, even though sensory is supposed to be blue and or sensory neuron. Okay. No, you didn't. You're like, I don't care. All right, so the motor neuron, that's number 4. Step 4. Just carries the signal out via the axon. And that one is from the central nervous system to the effector. There's the efferent pathway. I'm going to label efferent pathway there. Just for funsies. Oof. Okay, as long as we're not crowded here too much. So motor neuron, as promised, is red. And we're going to try to trace that down to the muscle, into the neuromuscular junction. There we go. And that's going to have an effect, and that's why we saved that space up here for number 5, where it has an effect. We should totally zoom out. Yeah, I need a better setup. It's true. It's true. So number 5, effector responds. In this case, it's a muscle that contracts. It's that muscle itself. Now, there's other reflexes that are more complicated than that. This is the most simple one that I know of. Okay. Down here, we have the flexor reflex, okay? It's just a little bit more complicated because it's not that muscle itself that ends up responding. It's a flexor muscle, okay? That's why they call it the flexor reflex, okay? So flexor reflex also is called the withdrawal reflex because you, as we'll explain, you're faced with some pain and you're trying to flex your muscles so that you decrease the angle of the joint and hopefully take your hand or foot away from what's causing the pain, okay? So we write that down here. So it occurs when the stimulus is painful or potentially harmful. So maybe you saw a snake or something. And so the idea is to prevent harm or further harm. At least that's the idea. Similar as above, only here we have a poor little kitty cat. Maybe it's a lion, I don't know. And its paw, it stepped on a pin, okay? So that's the skin receptors or pain receptors that are gonna notice some cellular damage here. So the receptors detect pain. You know, that kind of happens when, say, like a phospholipid bilayer is breached and some cellular contents just kind of dump out. So that can, yeah. Where are we? So sensory neuron's gonna send the signal. Cool. So that's the afferent pathway to the central nervous system, just like we showed before. There's the dorsal root ganglion. Dorsal root, we're not going to label it now because we just got that down. But this is a little more complex, so we do need that interneuron to integrate. So we're going to synapse with the dendrite receptors of the interneuron, and it's going to carry that signal to the axon terminus so that the synapse with the muscle, or motor neuron, is going to pick up the signal from its dendrite receptors and either modify it or whatever, past its cell body here, yeah, and carry the signal out via the efferent pathway. And here's the neuromuscular junction, and then to the flexor muscle, okay? And then that one's going to contract. Okay, think of it this way. If you flex your fingers, you're going to be taking them out of the way, okay? If you extend your fingers, it's not as effective. Also, you know, your wrist, your arm, if you flex that bicep, you're going to be pulling your arm away, and that's kind of the idea, all right? So anything else? Let's see. Let's just trace this pathway a little bit more. Number 2 was the sensory neuron. Let's do blue. Just to get that down. Number 3 was the interneuron in the central nervous system. Where should we put that one? Here. Now, our interneuron is completely encased in the central nervous system. And it's going to process that and go, okay, it's this flexor muscle that we need to contract. I'm going to highlight that like we do with our little interneurons. And I like to think that these are all like very, very simple, basic reflexes for survival, staying upright, trying to get away from pain quickly before it causes more damage. Number 4 was the motor neuron. Oh, in red. Gotta have that. Oof, me and ends. And number 5 was the muscle that contracts to pull away. So there we be. There she be. That's kind of tracing that whole pathway in comparison. Let's say flexor muscle contracts, right? Okay. Yeah, and that's important for survival too. And then we're gonna next time we're gonna go over the brainstem, and that's gonna be slightly more complex because we're getting more superior. So the functions are getting more superior. We'll have some reflexes like ducking and dodging. We also have a cross body reflex where you pull away, but you push away the danger. These are all things that are very simple life functions and don't require a lot of thinking or higher thinking and reasoning, because that'll be closer to your frontal lobe, and that's kind of just a simple way to think about it. I like to think of it like the zombie brain being like the simple brain that's not really thinking super much, but just trying to use its survival reflexes. So that's why your friend doesn't recognize you when they are a zombie, because they're basically acting only on reflexes. So I'll come back to the zombie brain. I think some people call it the ape brain or the lizard brain. Lizard brain's chicken brain too is probably very more accurate, which is just those simple brainstem and spinal column reflexes. So yeah, more on that. Thanks for joining us. Hope you like the nail polish I tried. Did not do any tiling since the last time I painted these, so they're not messed up, and that's why. So they'll be messed up later. Have a great day and just take care. Ask me questions, and I'd love to answer them. All right, we'll see you soon.